Hello. Today we are going to learn about the 70s. Yay, the disco age. I love the disco age. But we're not going to get into details with the culture. We're mainly going to focus on President Nixon. Okay. All right. So let's begin with the election of 1968, in which we had three candidates running for president. And this is right after President LBJ, Lyndon B. Johnson. So if you guys remember, Johnson was the one that escalated the Vietnam War. He got a bad reputation. Nobody liked him, so he didn't run for president because he knew that would be a big loss. So we had all these other candidates running instead. We have Richard Nixon, who, as we know, does become president, right? And his first year began in 1969. And instead of serving 2 full terms, it was cut short with an impeachment. And that was in 1974. And we will talk about that later. He won because he ran on the platform that he would end the Vietnam War. And that was exactly what all Americans wanted to hear. After being in Vietnam for, I would say at this time, maybe 6 years, 5 or 6 years, Americans were just done with Vietnam. They wanted all the troops out. It was an expensive war. It cost a lot of lives, and it was a failure. We were just losing. And the country was torn between the government and the media. Who do they believe? Who do they trust? And Nixon went ahead and gave the people what they wanted to hear, which was, we would take all our troops out of the war. We'll end the Vietnam War if you vote for me. So that's what he does. Now, of course, it wasn't right away, but the war does end under him. And then he ran, so he's a Republican. He ran against Herbert Humphrey, and he's not really that important, so I'm not going to really focus on him. And George Wallace, which was an independent, a third candidate. And everything in green is what Richard Nixon won. Now, sometimes it looks like, a president has a lot of votes based off of the most color that you can see on a map, on an election map. But it really depends on the number of votes, because sometimes these states right here are just small numbers of electoral votes. All right, you got to win the big numbers, right? So either way, Nixon still won. Humphrey took a few here and there, Texas as a Democrat, We've always been, we've flip-flopped over time. We were a Democrat for a very long time, and then we switched to Republican in the last couple of decades for the majority of the vote. And then you have George Wallace, who took this entire southeastern region with traditional ideals, traditional to this region, that are favorable, which I'm not going to get into details, but just think of civil rights, all right? Alabama, Georgia, you can kind of figure it out. Okay, let's move on. So who is Richard Nixon? So Richard Nixon, he had a lot of political experience. He first served on the House of Representatives in 1946, and he did a couple of terms of that, which, they're just 2-year terms. And then he was a senator, which a senator is a pretty important position because there's only 2 per state, right? He was a senator in 1950, did that for a few years, and then became President Eisenhower's running mate and became vice president to Eisenhower in 1952 to 1961. So he was vice president for 8 years. And he had a pretty good political experience. He did run for president in 1960, and that was against, what's his name? Sorry, John F. Kennedy. Remember I mentioned that he ran against John F. Kennedy, but that was John F. Kennedy's first time running for president. And the media, the television had a huge effect on that election because, people were able to see the debate that happened between the two, and Nixon looked very nervous, and JFK was very charming. And even though he didn't have all the right answers or the best answers, people just fell in love with him. So Nixon lost that election, but he does get his chance again in the 1968 election after Lyndon B. Johnson leaves office after his first term. So there was a saying that describes him. He was preoccupied with settling old scores and confronting new enemies, which will make sense in a little bit. Okay, so domestic policy, this is just how he was with the country. Any issues, any policies that transformed the country during his time, that's what we're going to talk about. Just major things. So first of all, there was a court case, a major Supreme Court case called Tinker versus Des Moines. And Des Moines is the name of a school district. Tinker, that's the last name of these two kids right here who are brother and sister. They had sued their school district, because they were suspended from school for wearing black armbands that had the peace sign to protest the Vietnam War. Now, it sounds very dumb in today's age, right? But, back in the day, we were very, very traditional, and, they were very strict in schools. I'm sure you know the way it was back in the day. So this was not allowed. This was not tolerated, because this would just kind of rally up people, rally up students, distract students from their education, and just causing kind of chaos at schools. So these kids were suspended because of that, and they sued, of course, with their parents because they're minors. They sued. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, which is the highest court, the judicial branch. And they won the Supreme Court case because they sued on the idea that they were wrongfully suspended because they were just using freedom of expression, which is the First Amendment. They were just using their right to, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to protest or assemble too. And their First Amendment rights were violated. So because of that, they won their Supreme Court case. And today, there's a lot of freedom in schools with students. If students want to protest something, they're allowed to, as long as it's a peaceful protest, as long as it doesn't get violent, right? So speaking of schools, we were talking about, I did mention to you guys that there was a lot of protesting that was going on all around the country, but it was centered on college, university campuses. College kids took into their hands all the problems with society at this time. Civil rights, there wasn't equal civil rights. And then we have the Vietnam War, which they felt was wrong, that we shouldn't be involved with this underdeveloped country that just wants, it's none of our business what they do. If they want to turn communist, why should we get involved? Why should we go to the other side of the world, draft Americans, especially young Americans, to fight in this war? And it's not a justified war. That's how a lot of college kids saw it. So there was a lot of protesting going on in these campuses. And one of the most famous protests happened at Kent State University, which is in Ohio. I'm talking a little too fast because I'm trying to do this fast. And basically, there was just a protest going on, and it was a peaceful protest. Of course, it wasn't violent. The students were not armed, but the Ohio National Guard was called to this university, and it ended with a shooting by the Ohio National Guard. 4 people died, 9 people were injured, but they fired into a crowd of protesters that weren't being violent. So it was very controversial, but this made huge media coverage. Of course, the media is really making its way into the minds of Americans during this time. And It just basically made the Nixon administration look bad because this was in 1970. Nixon was already president, and people were like, all right, Nixon, you said you were going to end the war, so what's going on? So it made the Nixon administration look bad, and it also, just kind of rallied up more opposition for the Vietnam War. All right, we have another court case, Wisconsin versus Yoder. So this has to do with an Amish community in the state of Wisconsin. So Amish people are just kind of very traditional, very simple with their lifestyles. And basically, just a little bit of background, Wisconsin at the time had a state law that required all people, all students to attend school up until they're 17 or 18 years old. That's like any state today, right? Not just Wisconsin, but every state has that law that you're required to go to school until you're 17 or 18, then you can drop out, right? But since there was a huge Amish presence in the state of Wisconsin, according to their religious beliefs, their children stopped attending school by 8th grade, which is like 14 or 15. They stop attending school, and they just they do full-time, family religious duties, which I'm not going to get into the details of the Amish community. There is a show on it about the Amish if you want to just know more. But anyways, they're just very religious and very traditional, and they start families young, and that's what it is. So anyways, the Amish community sued the state of Wisconsin because they wanted their children to stop attending, and by this age, and the state, was saying otherwise, that it's not allowed. So they sued, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Amish community won. They won because of the First Amendment. So they argued on the basis of freedom of religion, which this law violates their freedom of religious beliefs, and that's that. So I'm just going to keep it there like that. Okay, inflation. So the 1970s was plagued by inflation, which is an economic term. Well, I mean, it has different meanings, but in this case, it's an economic term used to describe the way the economy is going based off of prices. So usually right after a war, it happened with World War I, World War II, same thing with the Korean War, but slightly. With this Vietnam War, remember, we were in the war for 10 years, from 63 to 73. So in the 70s is when we started to see inflation, rising prices, things were getting more expensive, taxes were increasing to pay for the war. There was a trade deficit because we were increasing our prices on American goods. Other countries were discouraged from wanting to buy American goods. So trade was not balanced. We were buying more from other countries, but those countries were not buying equally from the United States. So that's what I mean by deficit. It was more in the negatives. It was not even. We were doing more than what they were doing. And we saw rising unemployment as well. So unemployment means when you don't have a job. But that was due to, that was mainly due to the fact that, well, people weren't buying as much because prices were so expensive, right? So that does cause, people to not spend as much. And there's a word for it, but I forgot what it is. Anyways, so businesses, they slow down, they lay off workers. And there's another thing that contributes to the rising unemployment. Soldiers, when soldiers came back from the war, from the Vietnam War, a lot of them could not find a job. They were kind of being discriminated on because people did not like the soldiers that served in the war. They were given a bad reputation because of the media that was showing them like murdering Vietnamese or just doing what they were told, right? So there was a little discrimination on that, but also a lot of soldiers came back and that they were also mentally disabled. They were physically disabled. A lot of them came back without any limbs. And the mental disability would be from like the PTSD, and a lot of them became homeless. And even till this day, you know, I'm sure you guys have seen it where you see maybe a homeless person on the streets, maybe in a wheelchair, maybe out standing with a sign that says, and with a cap that says that he served in the Vietnam War. And, you know, of course, they're going to be extremely old. And, you know, they're looking for money. They need to eat. They can't find a job. These are the effects that the war has had on society. Okay, who should be responsible for protecting the environment in the United States? So in the 1970s, that is when we really started to focus on global warming, or that's when we started to realize that we have huge climate change. We're having a major problem with extinction, animal extinction, and things are just not the same. And, you know, that's when we realize that we need to start changing our behavior in order to, you know, prevent more damage to the environment, prevent further global warming, and just kind of save our world, right? Save everything that is involved. So EPA, which stands for Environmental Protection Agency, that was established during this time in the early 1970s. So EPA basically is responsible for setting like standards, air and water standards, putting rules in place, regulations in place that are meant to kind of protect the environment. So before EPA, there weren't any standards, and it's kind of hard to believe this, but there weren't any standards for protecting the environment. I want you to think of the Industrial Revolution. Remember the Industrial Revolution, how much pollution that caused the air, like damage to the air and even to the water, because a lot of factories were like pouring chemicals into rivers that people were drinking. And there wasn't any rules in place, any regulations. People, companies, billion-dollar companies were not getting in trouble for doing these things. So EPA basically monitors the environment, enforces rules and regulations, and puts these standards in place, and just to prevent, you know, like I said, further pollution that can cause global warming and for safety hazards, right? So, you know, this is important because if we just let the environment, you know, continue to be damaged, it's not, you know, it's not just for global warming purposes, but these effects have a huge effect on us. We can end up with diseases and cancers if the government does not monitor what companies are doing and other things like that. So anybody that is caught violating EPA, you know, rules, standards can be fined. And I'm talking about like a lot of money fined. They can be imprisoned. Their business can be shut down or their corporation for doing this. Of course, you know, people sue, and then usually it leads to an investigation by EPA and things like that. So some of you guys have probably seen EPA like on The Simpsons or other like TV shows. I've seen it a lot. All right, so the Endangered Species Act. This was also you know, implemented in the 1970s. So before this law, there was nothing in place that protected endangered species, protect them from going extinct. We've had a lot of animals, insects, other creatures that have gone extinct, and we'll never know, you know, anything about them because, you know, there wasn't anything to save them. There weren't rules in place. So this right here, this law just requires that the Fish and Wildlife Services that are in charge of parks, that they are in charge of basically just listing all the endangered species, the number of species that we have left in our country. Other countries do the same thing, and just making sure that we're aware that these are endangered species and that there's rules in place that protects them and keeps us from killing them and from them going extinct. So that is that. And here's just a list of some endangered species that are listed on the website that are being protected. So why would it be necessary to protect specific wildlife? Well, do you guys remember the oil spill that happened? I don't know how many years ago, but it was at least 5 years ago. It was pretty bad. It was huge. It was all over the news. Every day the media was showing how many gallons of oil was being spilled. It was something that was an accident, but it was hard to fix. But they were showing how many days that we were going with this oil spill, how many gallons were being spilled out. And they were also showing the effects of the oil spill on like submarine life, right? Like fish, shrimp. I don't know. I say shrimp because that's what I eat, right? But other things in the sea, and how it was causing deformations. And I just remember seeing it a lot in the news. Like, submarine life was just, they were being killed. Fish was being washed up on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. So anyways, back to what I was saying. If you don't put rules in place, then these companies are going to do some permanent damage to the earth. And we eat the fish, we eat the shrimp, we breathe the air, and we drink the water. And that can cause diseases and cancers that can be passed down to our kids. And it's horrible, but there needs to be protection in place. So that is EPA. That is the point of that. All right, next topic. Women gain momentum. The feminist movement. We're almost done. So we already learned about the feminist movement when we were talking about other civil rights movements that occurred right after the African American civil rights. So remember, this is just the belief that women should have true economic, political, and social equality with men. And it was because, we had traditional gender roles all throughout the 1950s and the 60s. And now women are tired of these gender roles, and they want more freedom and they want more equality with men, and they want to be seen like that. They don't want to be stereotyped as like, oh, women should stay at home and they should be cooking and cleaning and taking care of the kids, and that's all they're good for. No, women want to be independent. They want to live their own life. They want to make their own choices, and they don't want to be judged for it. So the feminist movement was in the 1970s, and that ties into this right here. So this is Title IX. I don't know if you're familiar with Roman numerals, but the X means a 10, and then if you put a 1 before it, that means 9. So Title IX, anything that has that name title means it's federally funded, meaning the federal government gives money to schools. Now, the government gives money to schools for different things. There's Title I, Title II, Title III, there's Title IX in this case right here. And it just means that the money goes to different things. So in this case, because women are fighting for equality, this law requires that the money that the government gives schools is equally distributed amongst men and women when it comes to extracurricular activities. So for the longest time, schools, there was more funding for boys. So there were more extracurricular activities for boys. Basketball, for example, football, baseball, track, soccer. Those were all things that were only offered to boys. And girls had like cheerleading, basically. They didn't have there weren't a lot of extracurricular activities offered to women. So this law says if we're giving you money, if the federal government is giving your school money, that money needs to be equally distributed amongst boys and girls. You need to create programs for girls, and that money needs to go to them, and it needs to be equal. All right, so you need to offer basically soccer for boys and girls, softball and baseball, basketball, boys, girls, you know what I mean? And it just needs to be equal. So this is how it was before Title IX, the Title IX law. There was more funding for boys, which that means the blue, more money was going towards boys and for athletic programs and things like that. And then by 1994, it starts to become a little bit more even. It was kind of hard to like track and enforce, but now it's pretty equal with that. So equality for girls, that's the goal, right? Part of the feminist movement. All right, the Equal Rights Amendment. So there was an attempt, to pass an amendment that would give true equality to women in every single case. And it was not passed, or else you guys would know about it. It failed to pass. Now, whenever an amendment, is in the process of being ratified, it has to go through the states, and about 2/3, more than half of the states have to pass this, but a lot of states rejected the Equal Rights Amendment, giving women true equality. So why do you think, this was in the 70s, why do you think the Equal Rights Amendment was not ratified by states? So in my opinion, I think one, a lot of men were still very traditional, and they were like, I don't want to give, I don't want to have true equality with women. They kind of held that standard that they're higher and they're better and they should be more respected than women. But then also, I think it was also hard to enforce. Think about it. Women would sue for everything if their rights were not being violated, because it's an amendment, right? So you've got to follow it. But I think that if we were to attempt to pass this Equal Rights Amendment in today's age, it probably would be ratified, because times have changed, and now most of our country is used to, equality for both genders, or whatever you want to, consider it, and so forth. Okay, Richard Nixon's foreign policy, Vietnamization, and men relations with hostile countries. That's the idea of Richard Nixon's foreign policy. So as you guys know, Richard Nixon took over took over the war after Lyndon B. Johnson, right? He was an ex-president, and his promise to Americans were, take the soldiers out of the war, we're going to end the Vietnam War, but he wanted to do it slowly, gradually, all right? He didn't want to just like snap of a finger one day to the next, let's get our soldiers out, because then we look really bad. Like, look at Americans, they're fleeing, they just left, like they're sore losers, they lost the war. And it's all about peace with honor and maintaining dignity and looking good in front of the entire world, right? So he wanted to slowly withdraw those troops a little bit at a time, while training the Southern Vietnamese to take over the war, to take over full combat, and hopefully they'll do fine. But as soon as we left, the Southern Vietnamese were no match for the Northern Vietnamese, and they lost. And North Vietnam took over South, and today, you already know, it's one country, and it's all communist. So here are just some facts about the war. I'm not going to go through them. But just know that we lost the war. We had thousands of people die, thousands of people were wounded, a couple thousand people that were missing. We spent billions of dollars and nothing happened. We still lost the war. North still took over South. We could not contain communism. It was a big failure to us. And one thing that we learned about this war is that the media has a huge influence on Americans, and all the protesting, all the opposition was because of the media, what they were showing us. But it was the truth, though. Okay. So the war ends in 1973. The 26th Amendment, just remember, you already learned this. This was passed during the Vietnam War. It lowered the voting age to 18 because 18-year-olds were being able to be drafted to serve in the war, but they weren't even old enough to vote. So that's just not fair, right? So that's why they did that. China, this is important. So China turned communist back in 1949. I think I talked about it for a second when we were talking about the Cold War. They turned communist in 1949, and when that happened, we cut ties with China. We stopped doing business with them. We stopped trading with them. We just completely cut them off because we don't support communism, right? But this really hurt us economically. And, we really didn't want to do this to China. If you remember, we have a long relationship with China that goes back to the 1800s, where we had that open door policy and we were putting businesses in China. We were helping, China by employing their workers. They were working in American businesses. They were making American products. Everything's made in China. So it was like that for a long time, but then when they turned communist, we were like, well, we can't do business with you. Like, we're done. Our relationship with you guys is done. So it was like that throughout the 50s and the 60s, and then Nixon becomes president, and Nixon turns things around and says, you know what? We don't need to be like this. Let's work together. All right, so you're communists. I understand we're democratic. And we shouldn't let our ideals affect, our relationship. We both want to make money. Let's do that for each other. And then maybe later on we can talk about, maybe you guys moving away from communism and maybe becoming democratic one day. So Nixon restores diplomatic relations with China, mends things with China, makes things better. And, we start to put more, from there we started to go back to trading with them and putting more businesses back in their country, and things are good now with China. They're one of our biggest trade partners. I mean, we have a great relationship with them, despite some of the things that you may have heard. But and they're not so strict communists like they were before. So that's a good thing. All right, and Nixon actually became the very first U.S. president to visit China. Isn't that interesting? No other president before him had visited China because of, it being communist and so forth. Okay, détente with the Soviet Union. So détente is a French word that means peace and relaxing of tensions. So we went through a détente period with the Soviet Union, which is an amazing thing because if you remember, we had tensions with the Soviet Union for a very long time. Think of the Cold War, right? That happened right after we dropped the atomic bombs in 1945. From there, our relations with the Soviet Union went south, right? And it was just tensions, hostility, right? We were at an arms race with them. We were at a space race with them. They were turning countries communist. We were trying to turn countries democratic and stop those countries from turning communist. Like, it was bad. It was bad. And then also think of the Cuban Missile Crisis and, basically where we were at the brink of war with the Soviet Union. It was bad. So Richard Nixon focuses on trying to fix these relations with the Soviet Union, and it works. So the early 1970s when he was president, because he was impeached by 74, which we'll talk about later, he fixes relations with them. And I'm not 100%, but he just mends things, and we end up having a pretty decent relationship where we can communicate with each other, and we agree to stop building up arms, which is weapons, nuclear weapons, atomic bombs, things like that, because we don't want to give off that vibe that we're still angry and we're still trying to fight them. And we don't want them to think this, they don't want to think the same thing about them, want us to think the same thing about them. So anyways, this is a good thing. So here are the two leaders talking in person, working things out. I'm sure they were still a little, they had their guard up about each other and a little weary of, that they're, one could be betraying the other. But this is the first time where they talk and they meet and they communicate and they laugh and they agree on things. And the agreement was just halting the making of those nuclear weapons and things like that. So pretty good, right? All right. And we are going to stop there and we will learn the Watergate scandal, which is very scandalous, in the next lesson. All right. Have a great day. See you guys soon.